Welcome to the Reinventing Transport Show, the international podcast that helps you push for better urban mobility and better cities. This episode of Reinventing Transport takes another look at Auckland in New Zealand. This time we look at the city itself and how this car-dependent metropolitan area has been changing to boost a much more diverse range of mobility options. This is actually the third part of my December 2018 discussion with Matt Lowry and Patrick Reynolds, two of the bloggers on the Greater Auckland blog. In the first part, which was Reinventing Transport episode 9, we focused on their blog, Greater Auckland, and how it has become so influential in Auckland. The second part was on the Reinventing Parking podcast recently, where Matt and I talked about Auckland's impressive parking reforms. As I said, this new episode is mainly about Auckland itself. But now and then you'll hear one of us say Greater Auckland, which means the blog, not the city. Auckland's experience has a lot to teach other cities, and Patrick and Matt are excellent guides. I hope you find our discussion as interesting and useful as I did. Matt Lowry and Patrick Reynolds, welcome to the Reinventing Transport podcast.
Kia ora.
Hi, Paul.
It's very impressive that Auckland's a very car-dependent city, but it's unusual in that it's been managing to change its trend lines a little bit away from being so car dependent. Is that true? Is Auckland moving slightly in the right direction at the moment?
Well, both of those things are true. That Auckland is a very auto-dependent city, and that it is now undergoing tremendously fast morphological change, both in terms of urban form and in terms of movement and mode shift. So the situation is not great. The trend is very, very good.
That was Patrick. How about you, Matt? Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we're seeing in Auckland is we're coming off a low base for many of the metrics you might consider to be successful non-car dependent city, and so we're coming off a low base, but we're coming off strongly. And one thing that Auckland has shown over the years, not just in this space, but in many areas, is that we can change quickly. We've got a long way to go, but we're on the right track.
A couple of good reasons for that. Auckland is a city of now just about coming up to 1.8 million people on a very narrow isthmus between the Tasman Sea and the Pacific Ocean on a couple of big harbours. So there is a geographical constraint which is making the years of attempting to answer all movement questions with freeways and vehicles, it's actually hitting a limit. It's just physically not working, despite serious money and real efforts to try to make us into a little mini Houston in the South Pacific.
Yeah, Jarrett Walker from Human Transit, who I think has worked in Auckland, talks about this, the benefit of bottlenecks in some ways. That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is it that Auckland has been managing this shift? So you've mentioned geography. What are some other reasons why?
Yeah, so growth. So that sort of drive everywhere kind of vapid, dispersed model can work if you're small. Auckland was run as a kind of provincial town until this century, really, and then it suddenly got into the urban logic of numbers, and then you just need high capacity, more spatially efficient movement technologies and habitation typologies. And is now, along with this growth, is coming, the agglomeration economies and a greater intensity and vitality. So it's a kind of double success, really. But some don't see it that way.
Yeah, so of course, so these opportunities of growth and of a geography that focuses minds on solving these problems help, but there are other things as well, because of course you need a government system and local expertise able to take those opportunities. How has that worked in Auckland?
Well, I think the big change is that back in 2009, the government decided to amalgamate all of Auckland's local body councils into a single unitary authority. And having that single point of focus has enabled Auckland to then change its thinking and have robust plans that can be implemented across the entire region and have that regional discussion.
Does the new Auckland Council cover the whole metro area and maybe even a bit more? Or
Yes, it's the entire, and it has some exurbs. It has some farmland, in fact. We only have two levels of government. We have central government based out of Wellington, and then we have local government. We have no federal government in between.
So getting back to the amalgamation, so in some ways that is great for coordination. You've now got this body that can do the strategic planning at a metropolitan level. On the other hand, if you look around the world at where the really progressive transport things are being done, the political support for reducing car dependence and enhancing the alternatives is often in the core of the metro area, and the suburbanites who are more car dependent further out are often implacably opposed. Inquiring minds from other places might wonder why can Auckland be so progressive even if there's so many car dependent suburbanites voting in your elections?
We've avoided the sort of situation of Toronto where there's a war, there's an urban-suburban battle that takes place at the elections. We've had a consistent loose alliance of pro-public transport and intensification councillors across the left and right for various kind of local reasons. I mean, maybe we're lucky.
We don't have any sort of party politics or anything like that in Auckland, so it's on an issue-by-issue basis. You can generally find enough consensus to get the right things done. And there's not the sort of the strict dogmatic, you have to toe this party line and do this.
So Auckland is a very car dependent metropolitan area, and it's gradually become that way over many decades. But in the last 10 to 15 years, it's been changing its trajectory. Could you talk a little bit more about the status of Auckland and how it's been changing its trajectory?
Auckland was a very compact tram-built city in the 1940s, at the end of the war, and then into the 1950s. It had a ubiquitous tramway and a harbour that was plied only by ferries, no bridge across the harbour. And it was low-rise, but quite a solid density, or at least a high building occupancy. Small buildings, but they were intensely used.
And less than 500,000 people or so at that time, I guess?
About 500,000.
Then the 1950s and the 1960s happened, and the rise of the motor car and the drop in the price of oil and the American planning ideology. We literally sent traffic engineers to California to learn how to do it, and we ripped up the trams. We basically stopped running the trains and tried to build motorways and car parking everywhere. And we consistently pursued that policy for the rest of the century with as much money as we could find. And the net result of that was a city with a very high public transport mode share gone right down to the complete reverse end of the spectrum, and a very high level of private automobile ownership, and a whole lot of congestion and a rather vapid economy. We still had a very small but vestigial rail network, Victorian rail network, that was largely being used to move freight around. Otherwise, it would have been ripped up.
It was very close to being ripped up as well.
Yeah, and a declining and inefficient bus system with no priority, and a very spiderweb structure, so all heading into the centre and out again, often alongside those rail lines.
So this was the status as of about what year?
2003 is a good place to start for the rebirth. A new train station was built in the city centre in 2003 called Britomart that opened, and that's, to me, I like to look at that as the beginning of the Renaissance, if you like. Do you think, Matt? What do you think?
Yeah, I think possibly a couple of years earlier, I think we won the America's Cup, which is a yachting sporting event, and we were hosting that locally, and that helped start changing some of our use of our waterfront, because up until that time, the entire waterfront in Auckland had been devoted to ports use, and public had no access to it. Essentially, what actually happened was, back in the 1920s, we moved a train station out from the central city out to the edge of the city where no one wanted to use it. What we did in 2003 was we moved it back to the same spot, but we put it underground, and that's really where things started to turn around.
You're both sort of saying that the spark was getting a place that people had some affection for, that had some intrinsic attractions, and sort of just the beginnings of a rescue for that place. I guess this is very often the story, isn't it, around the world?
One of the things that came with the motorway sprawl era was a kind of an attack on the idea of Auckland having a centre or being urban, or the city having any value, or a place that anyone might want to go. The city centre became a place dead at night. The biggest battle really in the beginning of those decades were all about, is it even possible? So they were about the what and the why. We're now completely into the how and the when.
Right. Yep.
But you first have to get through the what and the why, and there were a lot of sneering from arch suburbanists and the motorway sprawl industry And I'm reminded of that great quote from Gandhi, who said that first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. We've literally gone through that entire cycle this century. I mean, we were mocked in Parliament by government ministers at the beginning.
Right, yeah. So the urban quality changes were actually the spark, and you're saying one improvement in the rail system. So
we bought some second-hand trains in the early 90s, and that slowly started to rebuild usage on the suburban lines, but they didn't go into the city centre. They stopped on the edge of it. So we rebuilt it to the city centre. By the time that was built, we were carrying about 2.5 million people a year. As of now, we're carrying about just over 20 million people a year. So they've seen some significant growth in the last 15 years. And about half of that has been in the last 4 to 5 years.
But the key second move after Britomart was our only BRT system, which is the Northern Busway.
Okay, so that was next. Okay.
Yeah. So we effectively now have 4 rapid transit lines, the 3 rail lines and this one BRT line. And this is really, really important, especially for Greater Auckland, because before Greater Auckland, every group, and there had been groups that had pushed for public transport in Auckland, had always obsessed about one mode. There was always going to be, they were either rail enthusiasts, or they wanted to bring and reintroduce the trams, or there'd be another group that say, no, the modern way is buses, it must only be buses. And this is a classic mistake, is to always focus on the vehicle first, not the quality of the right of way. And so the real innovation that we did is we brought a mode agnosticism, and so our rapid transit plan for Auckland, it includes every single possible mode. It's horses for courses, what works where and why, and that is also, by the way, why there's a very small group of train spotters who loathe us, because we lack purity.
Okay.
About their favoured vehicle.
What year was the Northern Busway opened?
Opened in 2008. That line is on the North Shore, which is currently linked by a bridge to the city centre. But the problem is, to get rail to the shore requires another crossing, which is very expensive. And so the BRT solution was a way to provide a high quality outcome and high quality service without the need for the expensive crossings.
I was just going to say, the lesson really from the Northern Busway for me was the power of the incremental, because in fact the Northern Busway, especially when it opened, was a small section parallel to a motorway, which of course is never great for a rapid transit line, because every station is always severed at least on one side. But that's where the right of way was. And also, as Matt was saying, that the buses merged back into general traffic to get across the bridge. The inner city section was again, had very poor priority, but that slowly increased. As the ridership grew, well, then the authorities accepted that they needed full bus time, bus lanes on general streets. So it's the great power that you can bring to a city with buses is the ability to improve little bits of it, time one after the other, and you slowly win the right to. It can be very powerful as an incremental.
Our transport assessment processes at the time were much weaker than they are now in terms of assessing alternatives. They are very, very car focused, and so one of the ways that we had, or not we, but the agencies got that across the line in terms of getting it built in the first place, was that they had to assume that and design it in a way to allow for T2, T3 cars, so cars that are carrying 2 or 3 passengers to be able to use it, or more, to be able to use it too. So it was assumed that no one would ever use the buses, therefore we'll design this. And there are a few places on the busway where cars could potentially access that, but it was put in place to get the project justification across the line, with the intention that if it doesn't work, then we can just put it on, because a lot of the officials just believed it would never work, and we'll just use this as another road once it's finished. And also a lot of the media mocked it and calling it a white elephant, what have you. Very quickly the bus usage rose on it, and people started using it. And by the time it came to the discussion of, do we need to allow cars carrying more, with more than one person on it, the answer was very quickly no. There's 2 lanes of traffic, one each way on the busway, and they're carrying about half the number of people as the 3 to 4 lanes next to them, or more. And so, ironically enough, one of the people who called it a white elephant recently has had to start using it because of for medical reasons. And he was in the media and he wrote a story raving about it, how wonderful it was.
Buses carry 78% of the people on that road in the morning rush. So that's the kind of math that the authorities can't. One of the reasons it succeeded, one of them, was that they, right from the start, they built train-like stations, train quality stations.
Uh-huh.
So in terms of experience, it was suddenly very high and as good as and better actually than many of our old crumbling rail stations.
Okay.
And the other thing was that one of the arguments against it was that this is a fairly wealthy area, and the argument was they were too posh to bus.
Interesting.
Right? No, but you provide a high quality, high frequency service, and people will bus.
Let's talk about the buses, because Auckland or New Zealand's trajectory on buses has been interesting, hasn't it? Because if I understand correctly, was it in the 1980s or perhaps in the 1990s, you followed the British kind of ideological trend towards deregulation.
Yes.
But then more recently, and I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but there's been a shift to still private operators, but with much more robust government planning. So it's much more of a government planned but contracted out kind of a system, similar to what's common in London, perhaps, or Scandinavian cities, or some of the Australian cities like Perth.
Yeah, exactly what happened is that in the 90s, a right-wing government at the time deregulated and followed the UK model of the private companies could take on these commercial routes and do whatever they wanted to with them. And what the end result actually happened was that the system was set up that any services that the region effectively wanted to run on top of those commercial services, they would have to subsidise. And what ended up happening is there were various loopholes. And so you'd have some bus companies would run the commercial service. So they might run the 8 o'clock service, but they won't run the 8:05 service that needs to be run because of the usage, but they will run the 8:20 service. And so to keep consistency, the authorities would contract out to the same company to run all the contracted services. So there's a whole lot of game playing that went on.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, a ridiculous system. I mean, they could cherry pick profitable routes and stick the money in their back pocket instead of using that to cross-subsidise the whole network. I mean, everybody knows you need a network.
In 2008, at the time that the then left-wing government decided to change that and go the complete opposite way of saying, let's have a fully contracted out service so that the region would choose which services we have, and they'd gross contract out that and take that on. And that's actually how the busway and the rail networks are running as well. And just after that legislation came into place, we had a change of government, a right-wing government again, and they decided that they would review it. The government decided that they were going to scrap the system and go back to what we had because that's what the bus company said was working well. After they started reviewing it, they realised actually no, it wasn't working well, and they came up with sort of a hybrid solution, which is best described as a gross contracting model, where the regional authority can lay out all of the routes and all of the times they want run, and they contract it out on a gross basis. But if a private operator wants to run one of those routes as a commercial route, they can, but they have to run all services all day, all week that are specified as a commercial service to achieve that. And so that doesn't happen.
There's been no takers on that option.
Yeah, there's no takers on that option. They can if they want to, but they by and large it's a completely gross contracted system. There are a few minor anomalies, which is basically again due to the lobbying powers of some of those public transport operators, but in particular one of the ferry operators. And there's a couple of ferry routes that are very popular, and so those two services, which constitute about 80% of our ferry usage, they are not under the gross contracting model, which is a point of contention for some of them because it affects how.
Do they still have integrated ticketing?
That you can use your integrated ticketing on them. We have a hop card, so integrated ticketing was introduced in between 2012 and 2014, roughly.
Quite recent.
And then integrated fares came in 2016, but ferries are excluded from that. But you can use your integrated ticket on any public transport service, including those commercial ones. And there's also a commercial service to the airport.
So let's jump to the new network now. So one of the things that becomes possible once government is actually planning the bus network and the ferry network is the government can then actually think about the network and what kind of network is needed. And this is one of the remarkable things that Auckland has done as well, isn't it?
Previously, all the bus operators wanted to take to the high demand area, which was the city centre, from whichever suburb they were based in. They just wanted to run those high demand routes in and not form a network. And so we had a very inefficient and wasteful duplicative system. Jarrett Walker did come down and consulted, and the decision was made to set up basically his model, the transfer-based model.
Okay.
And that has finally this year rolled out with a spine of rapid transit, so the 3 rail lines and the Northern Busway and the future rail lines, linking into more crosstown and new interchange stations, and we're doing the whole model.
So for listeners who are not familiar, Jarrett Walker, as a transport consultant, at that time he was working with MR Cagney. The shift is to simplify the network, have fewer lines. By having a simpler, more connected network that intrinsically expects some people to be making connections or transfers, you can, with the same amount of resources, achieve higher frequencies. If you pump extra money in, all the better, then you can have even higher frequencies. And higher frequencies allows those transfers to be more convenient. But I gather Auckland has achieved that relatively successfully.
So the rollout of this new bus network has been tied in with the rollout of this new contracting model, which is one of the things that actually delayed it for some time. And so they're actually all tied in together. And that also required integrated fares and ticketing to occur, so that happened a few years beforehand.
We've also built interchange stations specifically designed to interchange between bus and rail and bus. If you've got a transfer-based system, you need to really give a great deal of attention to the quality of the transfer, and that needs more work.
Yes.
And obviously, as you said before, frequency is king. If you have to wait 10 minutes between services, that's a problem.
Yeah. So the idea is, if you see on the map 2 bus lines crossing each other, the assumption should be that you would be able to make a transfer in the ideal connective network. Okay, so we've talked about how rail has been resuscitated to some extent, and how the Northern Busway was important, and how the general bus network has also been improved, and the regulatory arrangements. When did Greater Auckland start to campaign for, or start to argue for, a congestion-free network? Because that was part of the story, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was probably around 2012, 2013. The genesis of it was we had all these good plans out there talking about we want to build these, we want to do all these various things, but they didn't pull together, and 2, the politicians who were arguing on either side of it suddenly started ramping the costs up to infeasible levels to try and justify why we shouldn't do something or why we should do something, and all sorts of things were going on. And so we thought it was important for us to both have some really useful and correct information out there, but also to pull together what we know exists, as well as a bit of vision, and to show it visually as well. Because one of the problems that planning officials and agencies, the problems they tend to have, is that they're very project focused, and so they'll draw a line on the map saying we're going to build a motorway or a railway from here to here. But what they don't show is actually how the service works, and that's exactly what metro networks do well. And you can work out, I can catch this line to here and this line to here. And so what we really were doing is combining all of those aspects into one document that says this is what we think the future of Auckland is.
Okay, so it was network thinking, but it's the congestion-free part is also important, isn't it?
So the key thing that the congestion-free network was a network, and that we showed the whole network, and we showed in that first iteration, we showed how to get there over time, because that was the other thing. There was a lot of doubt, a lot of skepticism that we could ever have a full network. And we showed how, from the little nascent thing we already had, how that could be developed, and the missing bits. Congestion-free was Matt's genius idea as a way of framing it, because the other network, the only complete network we have, the road network, is the congestion-full network. I mean, it is. And of course, we all know that transit networks enable you to avoid traffic congestion rather than solve traffic congestion.
This also nicely pointed back towards what you were saying before of being mode agnostic. The key thing would be to be congestion free, and it doesn't matter what technology you choose, the right technology for the right corridor based on service considerations and demand, etc. But the key thing is, let's get a congestion free network. I agree. Genius. Well done, Matt.
One of the reasons for also that network thinking is we have a project that's under construction at the moment called the City Rail Link, which is effectively we have the rail network comes into Britomart and it's a dead end, and it doesn't carry on through the city. So Britomart has a constraint on the number of trains that can enter and exit at any one time. It's about 3.5 kilometre piece of track, but it unlocks the entire network, allows us to double the frequency of trains and all sorts of things like that. One of the problems we were having in the discussions was people saying, why would we want to build just a short section of track, a railway line from here to here? And they weren't understanding that it wasn't just about building a new rail line from here to here, it was about actually unlocking the entire network.
The airport rail controversy is another case of this clash between network thinking versus or single line thinking, isn't it?
Absolutely. And against one seat ride obsession and against mode focus. Yeah, so it hits every single button, actually. But the network, the great news is that now, currently, we have 2 additional busways being built. An eastern busway to a big area of Auckland that has had no rapid transit whatsoever. And the other one is a busway from the airport, again, to a rail station. So for the first time, we're building 2 pieces of the rapid transit network that are not focused on the city centre.
Yeah, there's a bit of history as well. So part of our legacy rail network is actually quite close to the airport. Previous plans had looked at extending heavy rail to the airport from a couple of different places. What's happened is over time, as more evidence has become available and more understanding of what the implications of that are, it's been found that that's actually not the best solution for accessing the airport. It's less efficient and it has impacts on the rest of the network that are not great. So we're seeing big growth in our bus numbers, but that's now causing a problem in our city centre where we've got too many buses travelling through the city. And so we need to look at how we can get better access for buses through the city, and that includes one of the solutions to that is putting light rail in place, and sort of modern light rail rather than the sort of trams of old. And so, because we're putting light rail on some key corridors, we then have the opportunity of saying, well, that goes most of the way to the airport too, and can we look at that and actually create a whole new rapid transit line out of that? So what we're doing now is we're looking at building a light rail line from the city to the airport, but the purpose of that is to unlock both buses in the city to remove them, and also to unlock new housing opportunities in parts of Auckland. And so tying housing in with that rapid transit development. And the other part is building a busway from the airport to a rail station to the east of it, and that will provide access for people who are wanting a fast service to the city, the fastest service to the city. So we're actually building 2 connections to the airport, but just not the one that some people might want, which is a mode focused one, the very mode obsessed one.
Let's change topic a little bit and talk about the land use planning that has complemented the transport plans. And could you share with me the story of how land use planning has played a role or maybe not played a role in the successes with public transport and with buses and with changed transport planning?
So I think the first thing is for many years from the post World War II era, Auckland sprawled out like many American cities and other Western cities of very car dependent, very sort of circular streets with cul-de-sacs and made it very difficult to access. And so that sprawl sort of occurred for the 50 odd years. What's happened is, as part of the amalgamation of Auckland's councils into one, we had to first of all have a vision for the whole region that was created, a 30-year vision. And that looked at how we can change Auckland's urban form, and that included public transport and how that integrates with housing and what have you. But then also each of those previous councils that have since been amalgamated into one, each of those councils had their own planning rule books, their own sets of guidelines for how housing was built. And so by necessity, there needed to be a amalgamation of those into a single planning framework for the whole of Auckland.
And just to remind the listeners, that took place in the years following 2010. The decision was 2010, and
so the amalgamation is 2010. So this unitary plan was how we basically turned that vision and how we turned into reality, and also how we amalgamated all those planning documents and all those stacks. They produced an image at the time of you put all the planning rules together from all the various places. It was about 7 foot tall. One of the reasons why we needed amalgamation was that we had all these councils competing against each other. We had each city council was fighting to have all the employment in their area. It was actually not necessarily a good outcome for a regional strategy. One of the good things with the unitary plan was the process that the government put in place to enable that to be implemented was that it required a very strong evidence base to do that, and there were some independent commissioners who were put in place to to decide and ruled on what those were going to be and what the outcome was. And so, to some degree, it was while the politicians decided what it was initially going to be, the outcome was quite often evidence-based, and the council had to accept that evidence, and therefore some of the sort of typical sort of NIMBYism type arguments that politicians might respond to and might fall prey to were able to be seen through and ignored. And so there is a lot of focus on housing at train stations and busway stations and what have you. So that is a core part of the plan. So the argument of we don't want intensification. Well, the alternative is that the evidence showed it was actually worse because it required a lot more investment in infrastructure, a lot more. That coming to the point of Patrick made before about by 2010 we've sort of reached the limits of what we could do, and that's what's happening now is we're getting to the point where that the cost of infrastructure provision on the fringes is so much more prohibitive for Auckland to develop that way that we simply have to do something differently. And the planning commissioners who approved it significantly increased zoning in some areas. One of the fascinating stats is that there are now more cranes on the Auckland skyline than any city in North America.
Wow. And the other thing that the unitary plan has done is some parking reform, some reforms to the parking minimums, abolishing them in certain areas. So we won't talk about that right now, but for listeners who are interested, we'll be doing an episode of the Reinventing Parking podcast, which will dive into that in a bit of detail. So for the parking nerds amongst you, please subscribe to that podcast. Okay, so there's this myth of the war on cars and that Greater Auckland would be part of this war on cars. Some things that kind of push the buttons of people who believe in the war on cars. Auckland has a regional fuel tax. It's also building out some bicycle infrastructure. And there's been just a recent announcement of some very ambitious pedestrianisation in the city centre, turning Queen Street into a pedestrian and transit mall, I gather.
The first thing is that between 2010, when the Auckland Council formed, and 2016, roughly, the council and the government were sort of at loggerheads over a number of projects. Biggest one being that City Rail Link project, but a number of others too, and what the vision for Auckland was. And so in 2015-ish, they sort of came together and said, well, actually, let's come up with a combined plan. And so the council and the government and through their various agencies all sat down. And the first thing was to say was, well, what are the common the common facts that we agree on? And what is the growth? Because they were all using different projections and different figures and different assumptions. And so they came down and sat together and said, well, what are the common assumptions, all these things that we can agree on? And what does that then do to how you think about what your options are going forward? But one of the really interesting outcomes from that process, and that was the first of a few stages of it, was that for the first time the government agreed that actually Auckland can't just keep building more motorways. We actually have to do something differently. So for the very first time in Auckland's history, the government agreed we actually need a rapid transit network that is connected and that works. And that was a significant step change for us. And so what's happened is we've now got this. It's called ATAP, which is the Auckland Transport Alignment Project. It's called, which is a combined central government and local government agreement on what we actually need to build to enable Auckland to improve going forward, and that includes a significant spend on rapid transit. It's almost, I think, 40% of that is on rapid transit, something like that. But of course, to fund all these projects that we need, we actually then need to have some extra funding because the current funding streams aren't enough to pay for it all. And Auckland has to pay some of that share, and that's where the regional fuel tax comes in.
So these announcements of the CBD in the city centre, pedestrianisation and making it a car light or car free areas in the city centre. Can you say a little bit more about that?
One of the interesting figures is that over the last 15 years, so the number of cars that are coming into the city centre every morning has actually declined slightly. But the number of people coming in by public transport has increased so much that more than half the people are coming in now on public transport, walking and cycling to access the city centre. And so that was, that was very, very small back in 15 years ago. So all the growth in the city centre that's occurred in the last 15 years has occurred on public transport. there's been no growth in traffic at all there.
That's a useful point just to remind the listeners that this is still a car-dominated metropolitan area. Cars are still very important. Even the city centre still has a lot of parking garages and a lot of cars come in. But what's remarkable and impressive and perhaps has lots of lessons for other similarly car-dependent cities is that the trajectories, the change, the rate of change is all in the right direction, at least, even if you're still in a rather car-dependent place.
No, absolutely, and I think that's the lesson that we've learned very strongly, is that you can't just expect to build one big system and go, because it's very hard to get enough funding to do that. You have to be able to build things incrementally and continuously improve them. So, as I was saying earlier on, over the last decade or so, we've rolled out integrated ticketing, integrated fares, we've improved our bus network, we've changed the contracting of it, we've electrified our rail network, we've bought new trains, we've made other improvements, we've added more bus lanes. Going forward, we're building some big rail projects, we're building some light rail, we're building some more busways. So there's a whole range of improvements that we're working through to continuously improve our public transport network and our walking and cycling network. And every time we make those improvements, they're additive. Then the urban form is also following that, and we're seeing, particularly in close to the central city, we're seeing strong growth in housing and apartments, and then also looking at close to transit lines. So we're seeing a very, very virtuous cycle starting to occur in Auckland, which is obviously incredibly positive, and makes our job, as we might call it, very much easier, because we're seeing those responses, and we can actually, as I was saying earlier, we can point to them and say, this is actually happening in Auckland. Auckland will do this if we give them the options.
Thanks very much, Matt and Patrick. Thanks so much for sharing on all of the big picture things and the detailed things that are happening in Auckland. It's been really fascinating. Don't forget, you can always go to reinventingtransport.org for more information, to listen to other episodes, to find out how to subscribe, or to leave a comment, suggestion or question. Go to reinventingtransport.org. This has been the Reinventing Transport Show, and I'm Paul Barter. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.